Hello, and welcome to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. My name is Derek McCush. People who come to Canada as refugees or migrants without legal status can be held indefinitely in detention centers or provincial jails. They may not have committed an offense, and there is no trial, but they are treated as though they are criminals. Find out more in this new episode by Serra Hasiloglu.
While Canada's immigration and refugee system is often praised for welcoming people from all around the world, the reality of immigration detention in Canada is unknown to many. Immigration detention in Canada is an administrative measure, meaning that it does not require an offense for a person to be detained, and there is no trial. A significant number of asylum seekers, refugee claimants, and non-status migrants are incarcerated in Canadian immigration holding centers and provincial jails simply for immigration reasons and without a statutory time limit. They are often treated as if charged with a criminal offense while under constant surveillance and deprived of many fundamental human rights. In June 2021, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International released a report about the Canadian immigration detention system, titled "I Didn't Feel Like a Human in There: Immigration Detention in Canada and Its Impact on Mental Health." This was my starting point for the research, and I spoke with Julia Sand about its content and impact. Sand is a researcher and lawyer specializing in public interest law. Currently, she works as a human rights law and policy campaigner at Amnesty International Canada.
There's a number of ways that people can end up in immigration detention. In some instances, a person might be detained on arrival. For some people, they may have lived in Canada for years and then end up in immigration detention. Perhaps I can explain some of the reasons why people are detained. The most common reason that someone might be detained is because a CBSA officer claims they are a flight risk. And what that means is that a CBSA officer might claim or believe that they might not appear for their next immigration proceeding. So between April 2016 and March 2020, and that was the period that our report looked at, flight risk was the grounds of detention in 94% of cases. Some other reasons why someone might be detained would be for identity documents. And then in a very small number of cases, officers may detain people who are suspected of being inadmissible to Canada, or if they believe that they're a danger to the public. However, we would say that even that label should be scrutinized. In 100% of the cases, even if an individual may have come into contact with criminal law, the criminal justice system has determined that they're actually safe to be out in the community, whether that's because they've been granted bail or they've served their sentence. The only way that someone ends up in immigration detention, if there was some sort of involvement with the criminal law, is that the criminal justice system has determined they no longer need to be detained. So if a Canadian citizen had run into trouble with the law, they would be free, they would be released, but because someone is not a Canadian citizen, they are then almost punished for a second time and held in immigration detention. With that said, I don't want to focus too much on that because that is a small minority of the cases. Again, the vast majority of cases, people are detained because they're deemed a flight risk or unlikely to appear.
I talked to Janet Cleveland about the impacts of immigration detention on psychological health. Cleveland is a social psychologist and researcher associated with the Sherpa University Institute. She focuses on the rights and health of refugee claimants, refugees, and non-status migrants.
I think it's important for people to understand that when we're talking about asylum seekers, those who are detained upon arrival in Canada, it's extremely rare that it has anything to do with the fact that they're suspected of even being dangerous or a public security threat or criminality or anything like that. It may happen, but it is very rare. A tiny percentage, probably less than 1% of cases. In almost all cases involving asylum seekers who are arriving in Canada, the reason they would be detained is in relation to identity checks. All asylum seekers undergo identity checks upon arrival, but in some cases where it's very complicated or they have some particular concerns, the person may be held in detention, the so-called administrative detention. But although it's administrative, people are in fact held in what are equivalent to medium security jails. Sometimes it's dedicated jails or immigration detention centers. Sometimes it's in actual provincial jails if there's not enough room in the immigration detention centers. And we're talking about a population that is coming to Canada because they're in general fleeing persecution, fleeing from danger in their own country. An important majority of them had undergone many kind of traumatic events, being beaten, seeing other people killed, illegal arrest by police, sexual assault, and so on. So they're all already vulnerable, and they think that they're arriving in safety in Canada. Then all of a sudden they are arrested and placed in a jail. Even if it's explained that it's for immigration reasons, it's a tremendous shock. All the more so because people, upon arrival, if they're detained, rather, arrested, they're handcuffed, which is also very shaming. People correctly associate that with being seen as a criminal. And that comment that we got consistently was people said, but I'm not a criminal, I'm a refugee, I'm asking for refugee status. Why am I treated like a criminal? Then they're detained for an indefinite period. In Canada, there's no time limit. Usually it's relatively short. In these cases, it's a few days, a few weeks, but when you're innocent, you've done nothing wrong, you're often traumatized, you're seeking safety. Many people have been mistreated by the police in their own country. It's, to put it mildly, very stressful, anxiety-provoking. Also not knowing when you will be released. There's a loss of sense of agency, loss of sense of control over your own life, which is very difficult to experience. All that combined means that there are a high percentage of people who have symptoms of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress during detention, and in a significant proportion of cases, it may persist for weeks, months, sometimes more.
I spoke to Petra Molnar concerning the violence embedded in Canada's immigration system. Molnar is a lawyer and researcher specializing in migration, technology, and human rights. She is the Associate Director of the Refugee Law Lab, a research and advocacy hub as a part of the Migration and Technology Monitor. Alongside her academic publications, Molnar also writes for the press on the politics of refugee, immigration, and international law.
Practiced law for a few years. Now I don't really practice much, but I used to do immigration detention work. And I think it's an area that really needs much more interrogation and more light shined on it, because it is a system that oftentimes ticks underneath a lot of the other systems that some of us might be more familiar with. I mean, there are thousands of people who are incarcerated in Canada's immigration detention in any given year. Of course, it depends how you define immigration detention. It can be something as being held in an airport, a closed room for secondary screening, or it can be something as long as multiple years. And we have had cases where people have been incarcerated for many, many years. One of the reasons being that the Canadian immigration detention system is one which does not have a statutory time limit in place. So that basically means that there are no laws that say an X number of months or years is the maximum amount that you can put someone in immigration detention. This essentially creates this ongoing effect where a person does have a right for detention review, but often, if you can imagine, you're in detention, you might not have a lawyer, you don't even have access to a phone or a computer. It's very difficult to mount a defense to say, okay, I should be let out of detention. So Canada is one of the few countries that doesn't have this time limit, and it creates this problematic normalization of incarceration that we've been seeing. And people have been trying to advocate for all sorts of reforms and abolishment of immigration detention in Canada. I would say, especially in the last few years, there's been some really great campaigns, both by scholars like Dr. Stephanie Silverman, and also, for example, a new campaign by Human Rights Watch that's trying to end immigration detention. But really, I think it's still an area of migration control or migration management system that a lot of people don't think about. One last thing I will say, from what I remember most specifically, when I used to move in those spaces and interact with people who were detained, is just how violent the system really feels. Not to go all legal, but I think it's really important at this point, the fact that we're talking about administrative detention. We're not talking about detention under criminal justice. Those are two completely different legal framings. Essentially, you're being detained for immigration purposes, not because you've committed a crime. And yet people are treated like criminals. And that is completely antithetical to how our legal system works, because at least in criminal defense, you have rights to an attorney or a lawyer who will defend you. In immigration detention, you don't. You're lucky if you have one, but it's very difficult to get counsel. And these spaces really, they are prisons. You go in there and it feels like jail. Actually, in some instances, detainees are even incarcerated in provincial jails, just a different wing. They wear orange jumpsuits. They sometimes come shackled with their wrists tied to their waist when they're doing their refugee hearings. And lawyers have been fighting against this for many years. All this to say, it is a really violent system. It's one that we really need to interrogate from multiple vantage points, and also call for an abolishment of this practice, because there's really no need for it.
Moreover, I talked to Sen about the long-lasting impacts of immigration detention conditions on detainees' mental health. Sen shared a previously detained individual's testimony from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty's report.
In the report, we highlight testimony from one person where they've been out of detention for years. It may have been over a decade, and they talk about how they can't wear jewelry on their wrists because it reminds them of handcuffs, or how panicked they feel when they see a CPSA guard or wearing a certain color that they had to wear while they were in jail. The impacts are real and severe, and they're also long-lasting. When parents are placed in detention, children are often separated from their parents. You can imagine the trauma that causes for both the parents and their children. Not in provincial jails, but in immigration holding centers, children can actually also be detained. The report goes into the details of being in detention as a child. Parents are sometimes faced with this horrible choice, if you can call it that, of having their kids remain with them or of being separated from their children. The impacts for people who already have mental health conditions or psychosocial conditions are severe. People's mental health conditions are used or viewed as non-compliance. It's an official CBSA policy that at times people with mental health conditions will be placed in provincial jails to, quote, access better treatment. But what we've heard and what we found is that it's not necessarily treatment, that people are placed in solitary confinement.
Cleland elaborated more on the issue of accompanying children in immigration holding centers. She also explained how even brief periods of detention have lifelong lasting impacts on children's mental health.
So far as children are concerned, the research is even more clear and strong. The evidence is even stronger than with regard to adults. In the case of children, even very, very brief detention has been found in most cases to be quite harmful to children and to their development, including developmental delays and so on, as well as immediate anxiety or depressive type reactions. The other thing that's extremely important to keep in mind is that sometimes many governments suggest separation from family as an alternative solution. So what they'll say is, okay, we'll only detain the parents and we'll place the children in some kind of custody, sometimes with relatives or even in a sort of child care services type custody. Again, the research is, and the clinical experience is very clear on that. That's even worse than the child being detained with their parents, because it implies sudden, brutal sort of being separated from parents in a very stressful context, whereas the parents are the children's main source of safety. If the children are with their parents, even in detention, at least one of their parents was there. In Canada, there's no family units, so children, when they're detained, it's actually with their mothers. You know, mothers and children would be on one wing of the detention center, and men are in a separate wing, so they don't see their fathers on a regular basis. That's also already difficult, but sometimes one of the so-called alternatives that may be suggested is to detain only one of the parents, let's say the father, and allow the mother to be not detained with the child. Is that a lesser evil? Not much of a lesser evil. Again, it still implies a lot of stress for the child and for the mother, of course, but we have evidence to show that that's really not an acceptable solution for the child, especially, as I say, it's in a situation where there's already lots of stress that the child is undergoing. So there's a very strong consensus that children should never be detained and never be forcibly separated from their parents, more than citizen children should be detained or forcibly separated from their parents. When you say no forcible separation, of course, that's more complex because that means that if people are parents and they're traveling with their children, essentially that makes them immune to immigration detention. So I understand that something would need to be thought about more deeply from the government's viewpoint. But in terms of the mental health consequences for these families who are asylum seekers, the majority will be settling in Canada, accepted as refugees, becoming citizens, and of course, adult children. It's all the more important to avoid causing them harm upon arrival.
Molnar also summarized how detention threatens vulnerable individuals.
The disproportionate impacts are really an important piece to all of this. When we look at the populations that are incarcerated in immigration detention, oftentimes we are talking about racialized populations, oftentimes men, but also, of course, women and vulnerable communities too. We've even seen instances over the years of solitary confinement, even of minors, for quote unquote their own safety, which of course is a really problematic framing. There's also been numerous reports really showing the link between immigration detention and mental health issues and the decline of people's well-being. There's been numerous deaths in immigration detention, sometimes due to lack of access to medicine or even because of emotional distress. It's not hard to imagine why. Again, when you go into these spaces, you really feel like you are in prison. Yet the people who are incarcerated have not committed a crime. There's something really draconian that lies at the center of the policies which give rise to immigration detention as something that we are okay with as a society. It does impact disproportionately vulnerable communities for sure, especially people who are either migrating, who might have a refugee claim in place, maybe they're separated from their spouse or their children. You can imagine how horrific this is, and oftentimes people don't even know why they're being detained in the first place.
I asked all my interviewees how communities of color are disproportionately impacted by immigration detention. Sand shared the following data from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty's report.
I can say that the report highlights that racialized people, and particularly Black people, appear to be incarcerated for longer periods of time. They're often placed in provincial jails where conditions are harsher rather than immigration holding centers. Data from the Canadian Border Services Agency shows that in 2019, which was again just the period of our research for the report, the largest portion of people held in immigration detention for 90 days or longer, for 180 days or longer, and for 270 days or longer were all from countries in Africa. There was a testimony we received from lawyers who also highlighted that this was their experience, that their clients who were Black in particular and were racialized were often treated more harshly in the immigration detention system. So, of course, this is clearly discriminatory, and it has massive impacts on people in addition to the harms they're facing while in immigration detention. They're also facing even more severe, longer periods of detention or harsher conditions of detention when they're in provincial jails.
I then spoke to Nicholas Kang, who's an immigration reporter for the Toronto Star. Kang focuses on immigration and refugee policies, border security, diversity, and human rights issues. He talked about the experiences of racialized individuals in the Canadian immigration system.
I think the migration of people, the majority of them, of the movement, are from the developing world to the developed world. We've seen that throughout Canadian immigration history. We had permanent residents coming after the wars from different parts of Europe, from Eastern Europe, those former communist countries. Then more in recent years, we see the source of immigrants shifted from European backgrounds to people from Asia, from the Caribbean, from the Middle East, from Africa. So if you look at the Canadian immigration system, the majority of immigrants, permanent residents we're talking about, or even temporary foreign workers, international students, they're primarily people from racialized backgrounds. So the experience of racialized immigrants would be predominant in the narrative when we talk about modern day immigration in Canada, not just because of the volume, but if someone coming from Europe or immigrating from the US, from the UK or Australia, they have a somewhat similar governance structure or system like Canada. So relatively, it may be easier for them to navigate the system than for someone who's coming from a completely different structure. That would have an impact on their experience of settlement as well. Obviously, we can never rule out the impact of discrimination and racism within the system. When I say within the system, it's not just limited within the immigration system, but within the host society.
Cleland elaborated further on the issue of systemic and structural racism, while noting that racial discrimination in immigration detention has not been widely documented.
By definition, people who are seeking refugee status, in the large majority of cases, are coming from the global south. Therefore, a majority of people could be considered people of color in sort of a broad definition, but a little differently, they'll be coming from Africa, Middle East, Asia, Latin America, much more rarely from Europe or North America. In fact, immigration detention is used against people, generally speaking, from the global south, not just in a systemic manner, in a structural manner, if you will. It's not a reflection of particular prejudice directly or racism in that sense, but it's systemic or structural racism. And similarly, asylum seekers, often a certain percentage of them, it will be for religious reasons. That is perhaps a little less clear because you have people, let's say Christians, who are oppressed in certain Muslim countries, and of course Muslims in many other. And so, as far as I know, there have not been documented cases of, one might say, actual racist Canadian immigration detention centers, like insults or that type of conduct. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I'm not aware of that being a particular issue or being documented.
Cleland also underlined the issue of gender and how men and women's experiences of detention may differ.
I'd like to say a word about gender because that's actually quite a complex issue, because men are overrepresented in immigration detention, not only in Canada, but around the world, and not because they are any more dangerous. They tend to be more often detained in large part because women are perceived as perhaps more vulnerable. I mean, it's lucky that women are a little less often detained, but it's important to underline that men are also very vulnerable. Many of them in our study were very depressed, anxious, had PTSD symptoms, and so on, as did women. Women, of course, may be extra vulnerable for certain specific reasons, like pregnancy or traveling with their children or previous exposure to sexual violence. There are real reasons why certain women are more vulnerable, but just a parenthesis to say that men are particularly targeted in a systemic way by immigration detention, and that's around the globe. Usually more than 75% of immigration detainees are men.
Following the discussion of the Canadian immigration detention system and the violence within, I wanted to learn more about what happens after individuals are released from detention. Karen talked about the difficulties of staying in contact with previously detained individuals. He further elaborated on the issue of community building and refugee resettlement, and what it means for asylum seekers traumatized by detention to start a new life in Canada.
I don't think I've seen a lot of research follow up on the person's well-being after the person is released. Usually, I think lawyers and NGOs who contact the media tip us off, flag these stories because they were pushing to have the person released. So, we are partially to blame. Sometimes it's just hard to follow through what happens after the person is released. And I personally don't think I've seen many reports of academic research on what's happened after the person is being released or what's happened to that person after he or she is deported. So it's sort of like when it's out of sight is out of mind almost. But just anecdotally, I have indeed been in touch with some of the detainees released, but it's hard to say because when I cover, usually we don't cover every single detainee stories. And the cases that we would pay attention to usually would have some unique aspects, usually involve mental health issues. To begin with, it could be pre-existing mental health issues involving that person. At least that's been the case for some of the immigration detainee stories that I've done, I've been involved in. So it's hard to say. We don't know whether those conditions have improved after the person is released and what sort of long-term impacts, consequences the detention experience had on the person. But on the few that I had heard of after their release, they tend to be better cared of by the people around them, especially when it comes to medical assistance, mental health support. I'm not talking about a lot, but probably maybe a handful of people who were released afterwards that I actually found out from their counsels what happened to them later. But just based on those small samples, they all seem to be doing better after their release. I don't know whether they had like flashbacks or anything from their days in detention. I don't know that, but they all seem to be doing better because of the extra support that they managed to surround themselves with. So I think that's also partially answered your question about community building and their resettlement.
Moreover, I asked Leland about filing a refugee claim following detention and how detained individuals' psychological well-being may interfere with this process.
So for people who are coming into Canada as asylum seekers, if they're detained in immigration detention, there's no systematic documentation of their mental health following their release. They may end up consulting a doctor or a health professional because they have health symptoms, but it's not part of the immigration process. The other case where there may be medical reports, a psychologist or psychiatrist may be requested, usually by the person's lawyer, to write up a report is in the refugee claim process. That's usually because, let's say, if the person has post-traumatic stress disorder or certain other symptoms that may serve to corroborate their claim that they actually were tortured or otherwise subject to violence, which is the basis of their refugee claim. So it's an indirect confirmation of their claim, in some cases, the mental health aspect. In terms of the impact of immigration detention, and I would be talking primarily about adults, because children is a somewhat separate issue. What has been found consistently by studies that have been conducted around the world in the last 30 years, including my own studies, is that immigration detention, even brief immigration and detention, and even if it's in reasonably good conditions, which tends to be the case in Canada, compared to many other countries, has a negative effect on people's mental health in a very large number of cases. In a smaller number of cases, it may have longer lasting impact on mental health. I should add, even when it's not long lasting impact on what we would call mental health directly, of, let's say, depression or anxiety or PTSD symptoms, still it can have an effect on the person's perceptions of Canada and their future adaptation or integration into Canadian society. It has lots of negative effects.
Molnar talked further about the ripple effects of detention, emphasizing the abolishment of immigration detention is urgent and necessary.
That's a question that we all need to be more aware of, the ripple effects of the violence that something like incarceration, whether in criminal justice context or in immigration detention. There's been some really amazing work done talking about the mental health impacts of people who are formerly incarcerated, the way that it rips community fabric apart, the way it makes people difficult to reintegrate into their families or their society. They're really living with this trauma. It can even be from a few days in detention. I've spoken with people who were detained for maybe a week and it left lasting impact. So imagine if you're there for months, if not years at a time. For me, a very short-sighted way of dealing with an immigration issue that the state of Canada seems to have a problem with: unregulated migration, concern about people going underground, or people who are kind of at the tail end or the last end of their immigration journey. There's different ways that we could be dealing with these things, not locking people up in detention. Because not only is it extremely costly, actually, the daily costs of detention are very, very high, but also then the ripple effects of the ripping apart of communities and families that it actually does on the back end. This kind of violence is really an important element to why calling for the abolishment of immigration detention is important, because not only is it about the actual practices from the day to day, but the kind of ripple effects of what happens afterwards, many years afterwards, in fact.
San explained that immigration detainees do not receive the same treatment as other newcomers, and this disrupts their integration into Canadian society.
One of the things we're often asked when we say that we think Canada should get on the path of abolishing immigration detention and immediately abolish detention in provincial prisons is, where would people go? So I continue to stress that immigration detention is not a form of housing, and in fact, it's disruptive. Sometimes people have been here for years, and so immigration detention is actually removing them from their homes, their communities, their friends and families, their employment. But for newcomers who maybe just arrived to Canada, immigration detention actually interferes with their ability to establish housing, to figure out their employment, to connect with people. An example is in the city of Vancouver, the city has created this access without fear policy to ensure that everyone, regardless of their immigration status, can access city services. But of course, when you're in detention, you can't access city services. And so in addition to being harmful, it's hugely disruptive to people's lives.
I asked the interviewees how academics, journalists, and NGOs continue to study and bring detention realities into public eye. Ken talked about accessibility to detention stories, biases in media coverage, and increasing cooperation between advocacy groups.
We've covered stories about immigration detention on and off. Started probably in the late 2010s, I would say. It's really hard to access information, as we know, from the Canadian Border Agency. When someone is in immigration detention, especially those who are being detained in provincial jail facilities, not just accessed by the media, but also even accessed by legal counsels could be an issue. So in the past, it had always been, even for advocacy groups, hard to gain access to even know who is in detention, who is being released, and about what's happened behind the jail for these immigration detainees. So around, I would say, if I remember correctly, 2010s, and starting from that time, there have been stronger and stronger advocacy efforts by human rights groups to assist immigration detainees. Slowly, there have been more information, and around the same time, there had been more information and stories about the deaths of immigration detainees. So there was more collaboration among advocacy groups and lawyers. The media actually also started to pay more attention to the issues surrounding immigration detention. I think what is always been a strong argument from the advocates is these people, they are not immigration detainees, they're not criminals. They are detained because of violation of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which is an administrative law. That's my understanding. I'm not a lawyer. So it's not like they've done anything criminal that caused them to be incarcerated. So essentially, all these different things happening at the same time, the whole issue, the whole regime of immigration detention in Canada under the spotlight. In terms of coverage, in my almost 2 decades covering the immigration beat, I've seen definitely more and more continuous interest in covering immigration stories. In the past, even at the start, it was more like just a hit and miss. Instead of developing relationship with stakeholders like the immigration officials, the bar association, advocacy groups, human rights groups, In the past, all the media just jumped on one story, and then the next day, everyone would just go back to their normal coverage and then wait for the next big immigration story to break. But I think more and more, that's partially reflected in the ethnic diversity of journalists in Canada as well. They have all these different connections with different communities and officials. There's more an ongoing relationship with all these stakeholders who are also interested in immigration issues. So we see more consistent coverage, not just by the Star, but all the other media on immigration issues and policies. When you talk about biases in media coverage, I think each media outlet has its own political leanings on some immigration policy, immigration issues. Some are more liberal, some are more middle ground, some are more conservative. So it's really hard to say whether a publication is being biased or not, but certainly I think all media is in different ways. They're trying to be that watchdog of our government to hold them accountable on the issue of immigration detention, whether a media outlet's position is, yes, it's a cruel violation of human rights. They are critical of the government's handling of immigration detainees, or whether another publication thinks that Canada does not deport these inadmissible individuals from the country fast enough. Either way, they play that role of being that watchdog to hold the government accountable. And I don't know how you classify as whether they're being biased or non-biased, because it's really circumstantial. I have certainly seen stronger and stronger advocacy efforts made by NGOs and community groups over the years. Even among immigrants themselves, they are better organized, better structured, thanks to the proliferation of social media. You know, you would have different Facebook groups, different social media groups of people, just random people from different parts of the world who would share information on these social forums about the issues. They compare notes about the experiences with the Canadian immigration system. So the technology itself has helped them organize themselves and give themselves a voice. In terms of their collaboration with academics or researchers, there's also a reckoning among researchers of the importance to do empirical work, meaning to do community research. I've seen more and more research projects that are in collaboration between, let's say, a refugee shelter and researchers at the TMU, Toronto Metropolitan University, or York University. I think there's a recognition, the researchers talking to being social scientists, you need to go out and cannot stay in your ivory tower. You need to do research in the field. And how do you do it? You talk to the people with those lived experiences for your research. So I've seen more collaboration between stakeholders, community stakeholders, and researchers for sure. Not so much when it comes to their relationship with media outlets. I think certainly they have built relationship with individual reporters like myself or others who take an interest in immigration issues. But given that at the end of the day, we are here as journalists, we're here to share stories, but we share balanced stories, meaning that we're not just a sounding board for immigrants or for the advocates, but we always reach out to officials to make sure we have a balance in any of our stories that we publish.
Mona explained how her research on immigration detention extends to migration, border control, and surveillance as she studies technological development.
I used to look at immigration detention more from the traditional perspective, both representing people who are incarcerated and also trying to understand the politics of how this carceral system has kind of been put in place, legally speaking and policy-wise. But more recently, over the last 5 years now, I've been trying to look at also how technology and new types of decision-making are being introduced into the migration management system globally. So I split my time now between Greece and Canada. to try and both be present in spaces where new technology is tested out. Technology like unpiloted drones, AI type lie detectors that are being introduced at airports, and also algorithmic decision making. Also, of course, because we're talking about immigration detention, we can also talk about carceral type technologies. So not only just technologies that might be tracking our phones or voice reporting if people are, for example, leaving detention, but also something physical, such as an ankle monitor or a bracelet that a person might have to wear in lieu of being in physical detention. So I do a lot of this work at the Refugee Law Lab, which is a research lab at York University in Toronto. I co-run this with Sean Rehag, who does a lot of work on the kind of quantitative side of things, and then a lot of work about decision-making and different types of pieces to the immigration system in Canada. Then I also run this Migration Technology Monitor project, which is looking at really the sharpest edges of surveillance technology and always foregrounding the experiences of people who really are the ones who are experiencing this. So not academics, not lawyers, but the refugees and people on the move themselves. So our mission at the Refugee Law Lab really started from a place of recognizing that we need more hubs that would pull together people who look at the intersection of migration and technology from different perspectives. We really felt like we wanted to create a home not only for Sean and I, my colleague, but also for others who are wanting to interrogate these complex issues from a variety of perspectives. We work with journalists, filmmakers, data scientists, and people who are really able to look at these issues from multiple vantage points, always really thinking about what are the impacts of this tech, particularly on communities that oftentimes are either unrepresented or folks who might not even know that some technological experiments might be happening in their immigration journey, but also from the side of, for example, refugee lawyers who might benefit from the development of different types of technologies. That's something, for example, that Sean works on a lot. But really the idea is to kind of create a home for a lot of this work. And my work sits more at the spectrum of the bad technology that's out there, the surveillance that is untested and unregulated, the types of tools like drones, AI lie detectors, AI type decision making that's increasingly making its way into the migration decisions that we're all familiar with, both in Canada and globally. My role is to really poke at all these sharp edges of technological development that are happening in really difficult and experimental ways, particularly at the border and in immigration decision making, because that is already a space that's very opaque and discretionary and rife with a lot of human rights abuses. So imagine if you start introducing unregulated tech into this, it just really opens up the ambit of potential abuses really, really wide.
Cleland discussed the responsibilities of academics and citizens.
I think the way that academics can be involved in documenting the negative effects of immigration detention and advocating for immigration detention reforms and abolition of immigration detention eventually. So, of course, we can do it, one, by doing research and documenting the negative effects and human rights abuses and systemic discrimination directly in our academic work. But also, of course, what I've done and many others have done is things like signing on to open letters addressed to the government, appearing when there are consultations that are done by various government institutions about immigration detention, and testifying and relying on our expertise to explain why immigration detention is so destructive in many ways for people. And I mean, over the years, we have done lots of advocacy, as I say, lots of open letters, including one just in the last few months that was organized by Human Rights Watch primarily. But there were many individuals and groups, especially in the healthcare sector, that signed on, and that was about asking that they cease specifically detaining in jails, so, provincial jails. So if detention would not be justified for a citizen, then it's not justified for an immigrant or an asylum seeker or a non-status person. It should be the same criteria. And I think that it's essential for Canadian citizens in general to speak up against that, but certainly as academics, if we have any particular credibility, I think it's really important for us to do that.
Lastly, I asked the interviewers to specifically describe the process of abolishing immigration detention in Canada. Molnar talked about channeling the cost of immigration detention system into community building.
We're calling for the abolishing of immigration detention. I think you can see in other jurisdictions that things can be done differently. One thing I mentioned before is Canada doesn't even have a statutory time limit on immigration detention as a practice, so it can go on indefinitely. That in and of itself can be a reformist practice we can call for. At the very least, let's put a time limit on it. But of course, a lot of us have also for many years been calling for the complete end of immigration detention. In fact, that is in accordance to international human rights standards, where immigration detention is supposed to be the absolute last resort, which, for some of us, that doesn't go far enough anyways. It should actually not be used at all. But at the very least, it should be the last resort, which clearly in Canada it's not. But I mean, from a cost perspective, it's quite mind-boggling if you think what this money could actually be used for: education, language classes, psychosocial support, daycare support, retraining, lawyer fees. It's a tremendous amount of money that the state is choosing to spend on a carceral mentality, when this money could be funneled back into community and it would have really, really lasting impacts there. Again, these are all choices. These are all political choices that a state makes when it decides how it wants to control and manage migration.
She also shared her thoughts on some of the proposed alternatives to detention.
We've been noticing there are a lot of conversations now about what to do with immigration detention. So some folks are talking about let's abolish it. Some people are talking about alternatives to detention. And oftentimes these alternatives to detention practices are ones that are electronic or part of the surveillance economy. So whether making a person download an app on their phone or telling them that they have to go and do voice reporting like we do in Canada. Essentially, you call in and you say who you are, and based on algorithmic technology and AI basically is able to say, okay, this is a person or it's not, based on a voice print that it has in the system. Or then we're talking about the more traditional ankle shackle bracelets that people wear. Oftentimes you hear politicians and even the media and people say, oh, well, this is so much better because it's less invasive. People are not actually incarcerated in prisons, which is true. But also another thing is true, the fact that these practices are also very violent and coercive. The people oftentimes talk about the kind of omnipresence of the tech, the fact that they are constantly watched, the fact that they have to wear the ankle bracelet in particular is very, very psychologically damaging. Because even if you're let out of immigration detention, you just feel like you're still part of the carceral state, like you're being watched and tracked at all times. And also your family, because you're interacting with people in your home while you're being monitored. So we can't forget about the psychological impact of this type of technology. There's a very real example, a very current one. You might be aware that in the UK, there's now that horrible policy of trying to remove people who are claiming refugee status to an offshore processing center in Rwanda. There was a flight that was supposed to leave a few days ago, and luckily it was stopped and people were able to remain on UK soil. And that's being challenged in a variety of different levels of court. But all the people who were taken off the plane were basically outfitted with electronic monitoring bracelets. A lot of people are talking about just how coercive this is, again, because these people are not criminals. They arrived to claim refugee status, which is a right that you and I have under international law and Canadian law. That is something that is fundamental to each and every person on this planet. And yet, these practices really criminalize people who are seeking protection or who are migrating. I think it's important to have this holistic perspective to understand just how violent this system really is.
Finally, San gave some details about Human Rights Watch and Amnesty's Welcome to Canada campaign.
I think that's part of what the campaign is built on. It's called Welcome to Canada. So it's playing with this idea that Canadians have and that we're often so proud of, that Canada is this welcoming country. You see images of, say, Trudeau at the airport welcoming refugees. And I think people have a real sense of pride in that. We have this idea of Canada as a multicultural place. And again, it's something that we really promote and put out there. Of course, that's stark contrast to the experience that people have within the system. And I think one of the things that was highlighted to us repeatedly when this research was ongoing was that people coming here had that same impression. Refugees would talk about how they faced persecution and that Canada represented this beacon of hope or light for them. And, they had gone through so much and finally felt that they would be safe and then they're faced with jail and there's no reason why. So it really shatters their hope and belief in the system and this country after going through all of that to come here and finally feel safe and then to be thrown in jail or solitary confinement. It doesn't feel like any level of justice. So I think from my perspective, it's an issue that needs to be talked about more. I think if people understood the system, they would feel as strongly as I do that it's not a just system. There's an idea that surely people must be in detention for a reason, because why would Canada do this, holding on to this hope that the system is fair? So why would we be putting kids in immigration holding centers? Or why would we be separating children from their parents when they come as refugees? Why would we be putting someone who's seeking safety or seeking a better life in jail? I think it doesn't fit with our idea of Canada. So it's important to challenge that, because I'm hopeful that most people, if they understood the system, they would also want for Canada to gradually abolish it, or to abolish it today. They wouldn't want people to be held in provincial jails for administrative reasons. An interesting piece of working on the campaign for me, or in learning more about this work, is this idea that the system is very dehumanizing. So I love that the report is titled "I Didn't Feel Like a Human in There," and that there's quotes throughout that really pull on this theme, because I think the system has continued to operate by just dehumanizing people. We've raised the statistic that since the year 2000, at least 16 people have died in immigration detention. Someone died quite recently, a few months ago, while in immigration detention. We still have no details on this person. We don't know anything about them. Of course, there are privacy concerns and considerations, but also if you're this faceless, nameless, ageless person, then it does play into this dehumanization. It feels like this dehumanization continues even after someone has died. One thing that I've found has been a real privilege is working and talking with people with lived experience who can talk about what it was like for them, and it puts such a human lens to it. It's not just a researcher or a lawyer talking about this broad system of international human rights. So I think that's been really incredible to see.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Human Rights Magazine. The podcast is brought to you by the Upstream Journal. I invite you to consider supporting the program and the magazine with a contribution through PayPal as you explore other episodes.